So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our first official symposium on the Brinck book series, book award and lecture series. We're so excited to have our three authors with us here today. And I first want to just offer a couple of thank yous. First to Dean Robert Gonzalez for supporting this project through SAP and funding this endeavor to support our research in connection to JB Jackson. To the jury that helped me work on this project, Sunil Bald, Felipe Correa, Kathy Lang-Ho, Nina Marie Lister, Victor Rubin, Thaisa Wei, Sibel Zandizayak, and myself. So also thank you to those of you who are online. I'm not sure you can actually see me, but thank you for being here. And most importantly, as I said, to the authors for writing these books that expand our understanding of design historically so that we can design better in the contemporary world now. Each of these volumes deftly investigates aspects of our built world and fit these criteria. The book should break new ground, be a trailblazer, a new study or area that takes the reader past former work. The book should contribute to the creative arts in an integrative way across the three disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, and urban planning and design. And the books should be approachable to students with writing that is relevant and offers contemporary understanding to the issues of our times with voice as much as subject. This afternoon, what we'll do is have each of the three authors present for approximately half an hour, and we'll save all questions for the end, where we'll have an hour roundtable where the floor will be open for questions from the audience. And I also have a few questions for the authors, and they may have some questions for each other. So I'm really excited about that part. And then finally, let me just introduce the authors very briefly. Tara A. Dudley, who's an assistant professor at the University of Texas, Austin, teaches interior design history and architectural history courses. Her scholarship examines the contributions of African-American builders and architects to the American built environment, focusing on the antebellum and Reconstruction eras of the US South. Her approach to the study of cultural resources is interdisciplinary with a focus on 19th century American design, African-American architectural history, historic preservation, and material culture. Our second presenter, Barak Erdem, who is an associate professor of architecture at NC State University College of Design, teaches and lectures in seminar courses on the history of modernity, modern architecture, and urbanism, as well as graduate and undergraduate studios. He is also the coordinator of the graduate concentration in the history and theory of architecture. His research examines the operations of transnational networks of housing and planning during the 20th century within contexts of decolonization, national liberation, and globalization, as well as in relation to discourses and political economies of development. Our third author, Stephen Whiteman, is a senior lecturer in the Art and Architecture of China at the Courtauld Institute of Art, Department of History of Art at the University of London. His research and teaching focuses on the visual and spatial cultures of early modern China in their global context. He is the author and editor of 8 volumes on art, architecture, and landscape in early modern and modern China and Southeast Asia, including the book he'll discuss today. His most recent book, Landscape and Authority in the Early Modern World, is a collection of essays forthcoming from Penn Studies in Landscape Architecture, arguing the potential of connected histories of landscape for expanding our understanding of early modern space beyond nationally and culturally constrained discourses. Without further ado, please welcome Tara A. Dudley.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. I'm thrilled to be here and honored that my first book publication, Building Antebellum New Orleans, was chosen as one of the recipients of this year's On the Brink Award. I would like to thank the Jackson Endowment, as well as Dean Gonzalez, Professor Cambick, and Rachel Jump for the invitation to speak to you all today about the free people of color who built antebellum New Orleans. So the years, share screen, not in my own classroom, so I was given explicit instructions and I still messed up. Here we go. I'm hoping you folks on Zoom can see. Thank you kindly. The years from 1820 to 1850 saw New Orleans become an important American metropolis and industrialized shipping center. Those 3 decades provide a challenging framework in which to view the architecture-related accomplishments of New Orleans' gens de couleur libre, or free people of color. The gens de couleur face a paradoxical situation where the stability of New Orleans' economy and racial hierarchies affected their success in building, developing, and speculating. Still, their investments thrived in a city where racial separation was becoming increasingly strict, and they helped to retain Black and Creole controlling the city. My re-examination of the many roles of the gens de couleur libre in New Orleans considers them as actors and focuses on their actions as a narrative architectural process, recasting the story of New Orleans antebellum architecture. The gens de couleur libre are an ideal subject because much can be gleaned about their architectural endeavors due to the nature of primary source material. Louisiana's Code Noir required free people of color to be identified as such in colonial legal and religious documents. The system continued into the antebellum period. When this practice was followed, and it wasn't always, their real estate activities are relatively easy to distinguish in public, particularly notarized documents. New Orleans' unique notary system facilitates research into the architectural activities on New Orleans residents through documentation of building contracts, plans, and property sales. While useful, architectural documentation such as building contracts and architectural drawings are extremely limited, as many New Orleanians did not formally document building commissions, especially for domestic or utilitarian buildings. Records of property sales, donations, and inheritances serve to fill this void, but again, were not always recorded or easy to locate. While these tools are useful in tracing property ownership and the use of certain building types, the motivations behind the gens de couleur libre are often found in more personal documents like financial, succession, and probate records. In addition, resources such as census records, city directories, and historic maps offer a more personal look at individuals as well as a larger picture of life in antebellum New Orleans. On the one hand, the wealth of available primary source material opened the door in my research for wider comparison of the gens de couleur libre with one another and with their contemporaries, both white and Black. By the same token, the nature of the resource material also enabled me to narrow my research to 2 particular families. The Doliols and the Souliers are among antebellum New Orleans families of color whose building, purchasing, and selling activities are repeatedly mentioned in secondary source material on the gens de couleur libre and on New Orleans architecture in general. Prior to building antebellum New Orleans, no detailed study of either family had been undertaken. This despite the fact that sources recognize the Doliols as prolific antebellum builders and the Souliers as preeminent property owners. Brothers and natives of Provence, Louis Antoine and Jean-François Doliol immigrated to New Orleans from France's Mediterranean coast between 1763 and 1778 during the Spanish colonial period. The brothers established long-term extramarital relationships with women of color, becoming white patriarchs of mixed-race families. Louis became involved with Geneviève Azamar. Relatively little is known of her background. Documents from her estate file revealed that she was a native of New Orleans and born about 1745. She's generally referred to as a Négresse libre, or free Black woman, or free Negro woman. In legal documents during her lifetime, it is not known when Geneviève was manumitted, but some historians agree that she was the daughter of Louis d'Azamar, who was a French political figure and an unidentified enslaved woman. Geneviève had 3 daughters early in the Spanish colonial period, Charlotte, Rosette, and Marie-Françoise. Then Geneviève and Louis began a relationship and possibly living together by 1779. They had 4 children, Jean-Louis, Madeleine, Pierre, and Joseph. Their 3 sons in particular owned significant amount of property in the Vieux Carré and Faubourg Tremé, often improving them with buildings that they constructed, if not commissioned. Eulalie Mazange was a quadroon woman descended from a family of color established in New Orleans in the mid to late 1700s. Eulalie was the daughter of Louison Chaval and a Frenchman named Jean-Charles Vivant. Louison and Jean-Charles began a relationship around 1777, a few years after Louison's father had purchased and emancipated her. Louison and Charles had 9 children over the next 25 years. As a free woman, Louison was able to enjoy the rights and privileges of property ownership. Louison's children and their offspring benefited from her real estate ventures. Louison Ols's daughter, Eulalie, and her children had an even longer lasting legacy with the city's built environment. Marie Liautaud freed Eulalie when she was 11 years old in 1784. Here's that act of emancipation, which clearly spells out the legal rights, including the right to own property, that Eulalie would then have as a free woman of color, noting, quote, that as a free person, end quote, she would be able to, quote, treat, contract, buy a fair sale in court, grant deeds and wills, end quote, and otherwise engage in legal activities possible for a woman and a woman of color at the time period. In the late 1780s, Eulalie began a long-term relationship with her grandfather's business partner, Jean Soulier. Over the next 20 years, they had 10 children. While the Soulier sons were influential builders, the brothers and their 4 sisters owned and managed a significant amount of property in New Orleans until well after the Civil War. By the time Americanization and the events surrounding the Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1804 began to impact the city, both the Doliol and the Soulier families were already well established in New Orleans. Through a new methodology of combining sources, as well as retrieving, assembling, and analyzing facts, I've highlighted the building and real estate activities, which were means where the Doliol, Souliers, and numerous other gens de couleur libre established and exploited professional and personal relationships to ensure economic success of the gens de couleur libre, as well as the preservation and perseverance of their community. This analysis is unprecedented in that it focuses on the creation of architectural identity through personal agendas, as well as familial and community connections. Creative reanalysis of the research material available allowed me to create an approach that is more inclusive and multidisciplinary, and that also shows that the gens de couleur libre created a unique architectural and ethnic identity through a process of property ownership, as well as engagement with and control of the built environment as builders and developers. By utilizing various sources, I illuminated this process for continued study of the gens de couleur libre influence on the architecture of New Orleans. And so here's just a graphic representation of the process that I underscored in my dissertation and in the publication through identifying the key players and their categorization into various constituencies, builders, owners, and speculators. And this led me to focus on the means through which the Doliols and the Souliers and their peers came into contact with and impacted the built environment, thereby creating this process to establish, maintain, and underscore their identity in the city of New Orleans. This process was the foundation for my research and ultimately the book project. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of my findings and summarize the presentation in the book and the manners in which the Doliols and the Souliers owned property and how they acquired it, how they engaged with the property and built it and otherwise interacted with it, and also how the act of property ownership was an important entrepreneurial tool for both families. Property ownership was a calculated endeavor by the gens de couleur libre, like the Doliols and the Souliers, to establish and maintain their birthright. And all the process of this, all the stages of the process that I just highlighted were relevant as opposed to a hierarchical progression. So it's not to say that one area of this engagement or their agency was more important than the other. They all really interacted with one another. Frenchman Louis Doliol circumvented legal limitations by arranging for his mixed-race children to acquire property that he owned both during his lifetime and after his death, by either providing them with the necessary funds or making the property available for purchase at his death through a third party. And he was forced to do this because of legal limitations during the time period. Geneviève Doliol and her children also purchased property independently, then combined it amongst or divided it between themselves to create enclaves on St. Philip Street in the French Quarter, both north and south of south of Rampart Street in the French Quarter, and later, as we'll see, north of Rampart Street or Lakeside, because people in New Orleans don't really use north or south. It's either upriver or downriver or closer to the French Quarter or Lakeside. And so here we're looking at the compound in the French Quarter on St. Philip Street that the family established. It began in 1794 when Genevieve purchased a piece of property that fronted onto St. Philip Street, and that area is in the lower right of this image. She acquired this property from another free woman of color named Maria Saint Genevieve, and the family ultimately lived here early on. With this purchase, Genevieve was able to set the stage for her family to acquire additional property in this particular area and establish a foothold as some of New Orleans' most accomplished and distinguished Black Creole property owners and builders. Lewis, her counterpart, expanded the family's holdings at this location in 1801 when he acquired a large lot, so to the left of the property that Genevieve acquired in 1801. And then in 1804, Louis again began to add to the compound by purchasing a 120-foot long lot adjacent to the properties that he and Genevieve had acquired previously. And so over the next 4 decades, the family made expansions to and divisions of this family land in the 900 block of St. Philip Street to accommodate the Doliol children as they grew older and began to start their own families. When Genevieve's son Pierre died in 1822, she inherited his portion of the family compound at present-day 935 and 937 St. Philip Street, as well as several blocks away on St. Philip Street in Faubourg-Treme. And so here, this particular lot, it ultimately amounted to about 1/4 of a city block in the French Quarter that the Doliols acquired here, ultimately served as a canvas for 2 of the brothers, Jean-Louis and Joseph, to embark on their careers as builders. And so here on St. Philip Street, they built several 4-bay cottages in which the family lived for quite some time. And all of those buildings are extant, with the exception of the brick house on the corner. It's essentially a replica of these 4-bay Creole cottages, but that's not the original cottage that the family erected here. And then around the corner on the property facing, on the portion of the block facing Burgundy Street, one of the brothers built another house for their sister, Madeleine, and her husband a little bit later on. And so we have in 1821, Jean-Louis and his brother Pierre Doliol, as well as one of their colleagues and friends, Norbert Fortier, who was another free man of color, partitioning off property in the 1100 block of St. Philip Street. And here in this area, we're still on St. Philip Street, but now in Faubourg-Treme, so lakeside towards, on the other side of Rampart Street. And part of this area had once been a portion of the Collège d'Orléans, but the city ultimately sold that property when the college ceased to exist. And so you have free people of color who are starting to move out of the French Quarter into the so-called the Creole faubourg or suburb in New Orleans, and the Doliols were among families to do this. And so as you can see here in the image at the center in red were a number of the properties that they acquired, many of which they built properties on. And here the Doliol women in particular took advantage of the opportunity of acquiring property in Faubourg-Treme along with their brothers. So in the latter half of the 1820s, the first generation Doliol daughters and sons invested in this property. Madeleine Doliol purchased several properties along with one of the half-sisters, Rosette. And then Rosette in particular sold a lot. And so here you can see the arrow pointing to that lot at the top, and she sold it to her brother Joseph. And on that property, he built the 2-bay Creole cottage that you see there. In the 1100 block, one of the areas that they built on in particular were these 2 3-bay Creole cottages, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment. But here we see the Doliols' efforts in the French Quarter in Faubourg-Treme, as they did in other parts of the city, emphasizing the active property ownership as a birthright. They used their family-owned properties to fund additional home building for themselves and also for other free people of color in New Orleans. Speaking of the Soulier family, we have Eulalie, who was an important figure in the foundation of property ownership for her family. She left property to her daughters when she died in 1828, and this was a house at 819 Bourbon Street that she had previously acquired in 1803. Her daughters, who I refer to as the Soulier sisters, never married and were likely educated abroad. Family and other archival records indicate that the sisters lived in Paris by November 1832. And by the 1840s, the younger sisters, Louise, Celeste, and Coralie, had come of age, and they began to appear in notarized transactions. Here on this table, I'm listing a number of properties that the sisters purchased and sold between 1840 and 1844, including the property that they had initially inherited from their mother at 819 Bourbon Street. The Soulier sisters did not receive monetary bequests from their parents when their parents died. They didn't have husbands to support them. Like their brothers, who were well known as builders, merchants, and developers, the women collectively owned land and buildings throughout the city, conducting business with New Orleanians of all races, and therefore they were able to support themselves financially. For the Souliers, ownership came primarily between monetary exchange as part of contractual transactions with strangers, as well as their neighbors in the free persons of color community. This process of acquisition by obtaining property for oneself might appear to emphasize independent actions or efforts, but the Soulier siblings really worked together and for one another to obtain property in such large numbers that they created their own birthright. The Soulier siblings had a stake in properties in Faubourg-Treme and many other parts of the city as a source of income. Here we're looking at Norbert Soulier's first purchase. It was an acquisition of 4 lots lakeside of Rampart Street, again, between Custom House, now known as Iberville and Bienville Streets, in 1819. And then in the early 1830s, there was probably other buildings on this property, but in the 1830s, he constructed the row houses that you see here. They're extant. There were other row houses that were part of this collection of buildings, but only the ones at 229 and 231 are extant today. And so here we have 2 3-story Greek Revival masonry townhouses. They originally would have had cast iron lintels, indented cornices, wrought iron balconies as well. And so here we're seeing a group of buildings that had similar features in common with other row houses, other dwellings that would have been on Rampart Street as well. And the row house also offered Norbert Soulier the ideal property type to serve as an income property. So one of the townhouses he and his wife, and for a time, one or more of his brothers, resided in, and the other they were able to rent out as income property as well. Unlike Norbert, who was perhaps the only one of the brothers who had formal architectural training, Bernard and Albin only built Creole cottages similar to the Doliot brothers. And here are 2 of the cottages that they built as investment properties in Faubourg-Treme. The one at the bottom in particular, a unique form of a cottage. It's a 4-bay Creole cottage, but you'll note at the corner, maybe I should have gotten a clicker or pointer, but you'll note at the corner, that's the primary entry. This is known as a corner storehouse. So the bottom floor would have been a commercial business, and the upstairs would have either been the place where the person who operated the store lived, or otherwise rented out by members of the Soulier family. And this was a property that the Souliers retained or in their possession until well after they had moved out of the city. Buildings on the property that you see here were also is a property acquired by Bernard and Albin. You can see in the plan, we don't have a photograph because there's not an extant building there from this time period, but you can also see 4-bay Creole cottages that were really part of Bernard and Albin Soulier's repertoire of building, constructed there as a speculative property as well. In addition to the act of ownership and how they acquired property, the ramifications of where the gens de couleur libre property is just as important. And one thing that I learned and that surprised me really when doing the research initially was just not only how much property that the gens de couleur libre owned at one time or another in New Orleans, but where. You might think that this was limited to the French Quarter or even the so-called Creole suburbs where most of New Orleans Creole population lived. But you'll note by this map that members of both families, the Doliots in yellow and the Souliers in red, but particularly the Souliers, owned property throughout the city of New Orleans, including the area that we know of as the American District, or the current Garden District, as we refer to it as well. And so the selection of locales for building and speculation, developing properties was very deliberate on the part of the Doliols, the Souliers, other families of free people of color as well. And it was based on personal choice, economic opportunity, as well as the various racial and geographic divisions that one might see and expect in New Orleans in the antebellum era. While the gens de couleur libre did primarily build vernacular forms of architecture derived from colonial creolization or mixture of various types, their work was not static, and it wasn't purely repetitive either. Free builders of colors chose to perfect Creole forms based on numerous values. And I've indicated that not only the Doliols, but two of the Soulier brothers particularly built the 4-bay Creole cottage, but you can see various variations within their design and construction of those particular forms as well. And so here in this graphic, I'm essentially showing the repertoire of some of the more well-known and extant buildings that members of either family constructed. And so here you can see in the column on the left, primarily Creole cottages, 4-bay, some 2-bay and 3-bay Creole cottages, especially in areas outside of the French Quarter where they're starting to build up the city of New Orleans. So you're faced with narrower lots, and so you need skinnier buildings. And on the other hand, we have the Souliers, in particular Norbert Soulier, who, as I mentioned, was probably the only one of the brothers or any member of these families to have formal architectural training, who is designing more high-style buildings, other building types aside from the 4-bay or 2-bay or even 3-bay Creole cottage. And so his repertoire was much more diverse as well. But still, you see them really just working to perfect the Creole form, and really without these forms, we wouldn't have the New Orleans that we have today. And just an interesting aside, and so the property, the Creole townhouse that you see at the very upper right, literally this morning, as I was reviewing this talk today, I had a friend and colleague who lives in Louisiana. He studies portraits, paintings of free people of color, but we have some research and interests in common. You too can own a Soulier property for $1.5 million. And so this is that very same Creole townhouse. So I'm trying to decide, you know, which one of my kids I might sell, or if I can donate a kidney to get one of these houses. And similarly, there was another house that came on the market maybe 3 or 4 years ago by Norbert Soulier. So one of these days I'm going to get one of these properties. I'm willing it into being because I've become so vested in these families and their work. And among my favorites are these 3-bay Creole cottages that the Doliot families built in the city. They're part of a complex of a hotel, kind of like a B&B present today. But you'll note that you have this doorway that's on the your right of the house on the left, and the left side of the house that's on the right. And these actually provide entry to these side galleries. And this was a particularly unique way to maintain the overall form of a Creole cottage, but in a structure that had 3 bays. Again, we're in Faubourg Treme here, and so the lots were narrower. The Doliots were purchasing in the 1820s at that time period, and here they were developing another enclave of, for their family to live in. Jean-Louis Doliot lived here, as well as his son Louis Droissin from his first marriage, and then from his second marriage, his son Emile also became trained in architecture and building. And so the 2 sons actually operated their practice in one of these buildings. And so you might imagine members of the families, you know, communicating with each other. Can I get some sugar or whatever from these galleries? But you'll note overall, you have free people of color really focusing on creative representation of the cottage form in the kinds of narrower cottages that they built. Of course, we know of New Orleans as being a mecca for the shotgun house, but prior to the Civil War, you have mostly native builders like the Doliots, like the Souliers, focusing on these narrower forms of Creole cottages as opposed to the shotgun house, which was a little bit of a later development that many of the gens de couleur libre who immigrated from Saint-Domingue or present-day Haiti were bringing with them to the city of New Orleans. The act of engagement and really using property to serve as an entrepreneurial tool was also very important for the gens de couleur libre. The privileges that the Doliols and the Souliers enjoyed as free men, as well as their reputation in white Creole as well as Anglo communities via their familial connections and associations, really affected their professional lives as well, allowing them to own real estate, enter into contracts, lease property, trade on the open market. And by these means, they acquired wealth and became pillars of their communities, exerting a form of control not seen in some other antebellum communities of free people of color. That's one of the things that makes the New Orleans community of gens de couleur libre so unique. The business of property ownership is really spelled out in the Souliers ledgers. They are found in the Historic New Orleans collection in New Orleans. And it's one of these cases for me where you know that something exists because you see it in the finding aid online, but the minute that they brought out these giant ledgers to me and I opened them up and see the names of the Soulier family members was really magical, even as I'm sneezing from the dust that's accumulated from these. And so you can see in documents like this, as well as marriage contracts, even credit ratings available at the time, tax registers, estate files, just how important a tool property ownership was for these families. And so here on these pages that I've highlighted, just the list of properties that they owned and on which they had others build. The brothers were skilled builders, but they had the means to have others, family members, others in their community, their neighbors, build properties that they would then rent out. And here are examples of some of these dwellings. We had cottages, row houses, and various building forms that they use as investment properties. Census records also give us an idea of the wealth of the individuals in these families. The census of 1850 was the first to record property values. And so here you can see the value of, how the worth of the individuals of some of these families. And in particular, the Souliers were even money lenders who financed other real estate inventors. I found a notice that they even rented property, or not rented property, gave a loan to James Galliard, who was an important New Orleans architect as well. And so building and real estate activities really were means by which the gens de couleur libre established, but also exploited personal and professional relationships to ensure their individual economic success, as well as the success and maintenance of the community of free people of color. And so you see the families working together, but also these individuals working with other free people of color. And these maps in particular highlight the influence that the Doliols especially had in this manner on the built environment, along with their friend and neighbor, Francois Boisdoré. On the left, we're looking at a graphic that shows a bunch of properties that the Doliols and Boisdoré owned right next door to one another. And the image on the right shows that when upon the city's planned expansion of Esplanade Avenue, that avenue was basically running into property that was jointly owned by one of the Doliol brothers and Francois Boisdoré. And so essentially for a couple of decades, they held the city off until the city ultimately said, okay, we'll pay you what you want, we'll put sidewalks, etc. on this property. So in that way, they were able to maintain control of their community, of the property that they owned, in order to also influence their neighbors in the area to do the same thing. The contributions of the families are also spelled out, as I mentioned, in marriage contracts. Here we're looking at a contract of indenture for Émile Herrier, who was Jean-Louis Doliol's stepson. His mother had indentured him to be a builder or craftsman, and that ultimately proved very fruitful, as we've seen, because the two Doliol brothers, Doliol and Herrier, went into practice for themselves. And so here we're looking at a drawing that they produced for a building contract for Creole cottage for Marguerite Dauphin. And the Doliols in particular really maintained this connection. Jean-Louis and Genevieve, their line died out, but his other brother, Jean-Francois, who also had a relationship with a Black woman in the city, their line continued, and members of that family live in the city today. And up until fairly recently, in almost every generation, there was a member of the family who was somehow involved in the building or construction trades, including Milford Doliol, who you see pictured here, who was a plasterer, but also known as a preeminent jazz musician in the city of New Orleans. The Souliers, on the other hand, left New Orleans. Norbert Soulier first in 1832 for a number of reasons, and most of the brothers and all of the sisters followed suit. They went to Paris, the birthplace of their father, France. So he was born in Paris, but they left and went there. Bernard and his wife, Eliza, stayed in New Orleans, took care of the family's interests until ultimately, with various things changing culturally, racially, politically in the United States and New Orleans, ultimately in 1875, Bernard and Eliza left to join the rest of the family. And I discovered just in one line of their marriage contract that ultimately it had always been the family's intent to leave Louisiana. And so they really use their property ownership and speculation as a means by which to acquire wealth that would allow them to do so ultimately. And so the Doliols and the Souliers are only two families of the many free people of color who have rarely been appreciated as the architects, not simply builders or craftsmen, that they truly were. And so the goal of my continued research on the gens de couleur libre is not only to expand knowledge of and preserve their identities and architectural contributions. As I continue to research the influence of the gens de couleur libre, I hope to shed more light on just how important their contributions, aside from more widely explored areas like foodways, music, and dress, are and have been to the city of New Orleans. It is my desire to preserve, to conserve, and protect and maintain their legacy by reintroducing and recasting their stories. In his book, Our Men and Our History, free man of color Dedun left this quote, ending with, "It is to be supposed that the men of tomorrow will ask about the men of yesterday." And so it's my challenge and my challenge to you to rethink our understanding of not only the preservation and architecture of free people of color or other marginalized communities, but also through the rethinking and retelling of their contributions to restore and place them to their rightful place in the canon of architectural history, in some cases, Black history, and overall in American history. Thank you very much.
That's it. Yeah. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Yes, so it's great to be here, and I'd like to add my thanks to the award committee, Dean Robert Gonzalez, and the School of Architecture here for inviting us and selecting our books for this wonderful award. First of all, what a brilliant idea, to establish a book award and an associated symposium honoring the legacy and influence of J.B. Jackson, and to generate conversations at the school based on books. And I think this is a wonderful idea for architecture and design schools. Second, it is certainly a great honor to be among such outstanding authors and books, both today and from previous years of this award. Also, I would like to say that this has been a great opportunity to think about my book in relation to J.B. Jackson's scholarship as well as Tara and Stephen's outstanding books, this has already opened new avenues of exploration for me as I worked on this talk today. And so, so thank you for that. And I think some of that will come across as I talk about what I tried to do with this book today. So at the center of this book is the creation of this landscape that you see over on the right. The Middle East Technical University in Ankara, Turkey, as a model nation in miniature, next to the nation's capital and at the height of the Cold War during the 1950s in the Middle East. Despite recent encroachments, the METÜ campus remains to be the largest greenway left in the middle of this otherwise sprawling city, which of course speaks to the continued power and influence of this landscape in the Turkish psyche. And at the center of this university is a School of Architecture and Planning, just like yours. Although this one is a little unusual in several ways. First, it was the university's founding academic building. It was the university's founding academic building. And the first academic building to be built on METÜ's new campus. In fact, the building itself was designed as the campus in miniature, with its long central axis of the campus reappearing as the social space of the building itself that you see running through the center of the massing of the building. And while the rest of the campus was being built, as you see in this photo, the architecture building initially housed all of the key departments of the university in the various pods and wings that branched out from the central LA. And furthermore, based on the university's initial curriculum, all the students entering the university went through a 3-year common curriculum in design and general education before going into their areas of specialization in architecture, community planning, public administration, or engineering. The second unusual thing about METÜ is that its students and graduates aren't necessarily celebrated for their outstanding architectural productions, although they are good at that as well. But rather, they are known for their long-standing political consciousness and activism. Here you see architecture students holding up signs against state-sponsored speculative development projects and the privatization of urban land during their commencement ceremonies. This is an unusual ritual that happens every year. So instead of lofty speeches about dreams and goals, they remain connected with their everyday realities of their modernity. The first sign on your left reads, Rant için değil, halk için mimarlık, which translates architecture not for capital, but for people. And then the second one reads, bu stadyum çok büyük, AVM yapalım. And so the translation of that is, this stadium takes up a lot of space. It would make a great shopping mall. So this latter one is, of course, a satirical commentary on the Turkish administration's recent plans to turn Gezi Park in Istanbul into a shopping mall and mixed-use development project, which led to the Gezi Park events of the summer of 2013 and coincided with the Arab Spring. And keep this landscape in mind for a second, because we'll come back to it shortly. Back at METÜ, this feeling of activism and solidarity extend into the everyday life and spaces of the university and the hallways of the School of Architecture, which were designed to operate as extensions of the spaces of the campus into the interior of the building and vice versa. In these spaces, one is surrounded by echoes of movement and conversation, where everyone ranging from the janitorial staff to the dean treat each other with an extraordinary level of solidarity and respect. This is exemplified by, for instance, the long-standing practice of everyone calling each other hoja or professor. Hey, professor, how are you doing? Hey, professor. Everyone just kind of calls each other professor as a way of kind of leveling the whole field. And this practice actually extends into the city, in certain areas of the city, cultural centers of the city, and so on. Like any greeting, though, it can be used in 1,000 different ways, you know, like bless your heart kind of way. And but essentially, it has a way of leveling all rank and pretension, and instead replacing it with genuine and endearing conversation. All of this comes together in the school's celebrated cafe, which has acted as the social and intellectual hub of the school ever since its beginnings. I should note here that my personal connections to this place are numerous, and they began early in my life when, as I discuss at the end of the book, my dad was doing his master's in the Department of Restoration and Preservation. And in the early 1990s, while I was pursuing my Bachelor of Architecture degree in the United States, I took a year and attended METU for a year in the early 90s, as I mentioned. It was a really transformative year for me to plant myself in Ankara and to kind of learn from the atmosphere that METU provides. As I continued my studies into graduate work and began to think more deeply about the built environment and politics of architectural production and so on, I became ever more fascinated with METU, the function and organization of its campus, how it came about, and how the school sustained its political consciousness in the face of a globalizing world. Existing histories of the school trace the roots of its activism to the student movements of the late 1960s and early 70s in Turkey, and to the spaces of the campus associated with these events. The burning of US Ambassador Robert Comer's car in 1969 in front of METU's Central Administration Building is among the first of these events that come to mind. Comer was known as Blowtorch Comer, as he was the mastermind of pacification programs in Vietnam and was appointed to Turkey after that appointment as the American ambassador. Another event was the inscription of the word Devrim that you see on the right, or revolution, in mega-sized letters and with some type of a chemically enhanced magic paint that would not disappear or could not be taken off, and therefore became the topic of urban legends. And this was painted onto the poured-in-place concrete bleachers of the METU Stadium. This is, of course, the same stadium where the students were marching with those signs during commencement ceremonies and so on. Although seen as an act of terrorism at the time, and resulted in the incarceration of the involved students, it has become a commemorative site where students, faculty, and administration come out to repaint the letters annually during METU's Spring Festival, which should be coming up in April. You see people repainting the sign there. When compared with other university stadiums in the US, METU's stark contrast as a political landscape becomes apparent. Digging a little deeper, though, beyond the late 1960s, the story gets a little bit more complicated. It turns out that METU had a long-lost twin. What is it? What is it hiding, right? So a complicated family history emerges. It turns out that METU's beginnings was linked to Gezi Park after all, and to the making of another landscape of development of boulevards and apartments in Istanbul. In Istanbul, throughout Turkey, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Middle East. Think about the unnecessary landscape of destruction caused by the recent earthquakes in southeastern Turkey and Syria due to lack of building and construction inspections and so on. This landscape is related to that. Mittu's direct twin was this particular building project that appears on the upper right corner of the right image, at the very top there. I'll show you a better image of that in just a second. It was this one building project, and what lurks beneath and around it is what allowed me to look at these two landscapes in relation to one another. Let's see. To the initial dismay and utter surprise of many Mittu students, alumni, and faculty, Mittu had blood ties to this building project that at first glance appeared formally, stylistically, and even ideologically totally different from Mittu. The first Hilton International Hotel outside of the territories of the United States was designed and constructed in Istanbul, Turkey in the 1950s, which of course speaks to the geopolitical significance of this territory, this urban landscape, and the symbolic importance of this landscape overlooking the Bosphorus, the body of water that connected the Soviet-controlled Black Sea to the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The hotel project was carried out through a collaboration between US and Turkish governments and was designed by Gordon Bonshaft of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, working in collaboration with the celebrated Turkish architect Sedat Hakkı Eldem, a kind of a Frank Lloyd Wright figure in Turkey. The whole post-colonial and transnational history of Mittu starts here. The striking similarity between Bonshaft and Eldem in this image is noteworthy. Maybe they were long-lost twins too. In fact, the story I'm telling you today could really be told through an analysis of this single photograph on the right. The male subjectivities that it captures, and in terms of the rivalry and cooperation that ensued between these two entities. However, it's another concurrent development that allowed me to examine these two landscapes in relation to one another. It turns out that the SOM team, while working on the Hilton Hotel, was also commissioned by the Turkish and American agencies to conduct a survey of housing and construction across Turkey as a whole, including the areas affected by the recent earthquakes, to establish housing and construction finance with links to American funding agencies and as the engine of Turkey's post-war economy. This project was carried out in conjunction with the construction of a new national defense and highway network, funded by the Marshall Plan and US planning expertise that would connect the country and the city more seamlessly than ever before. Not unlike the way the US housing market, backed by Federal Housing Administration loans, shaped the American urban and suburban landscapes. The SOM report sought to rationalize and shape Turkish urban and rural landscapes. The report was accompanied by exhibitions of American-style domesticity and detached single-family home in international exhibitions in Istanbul and Izmir. Although, strangely enough, it wasn't the single-family home that became the building block of Turkey's post-war economy. Instead, it was the apartment, which mirrored the Hilton with its clean lines and concrete frame, and became a model of Turkish modernity. So while the apartments and the Hilton reflected each other, in rivalry and stared at each other down like Eldem and Bonshaft, the Turkish professional and bureaucratic elite became transiently and territorial and anxious about the proliferation of American models of development. So when the US and UN experts arrived in Turkey to implement housing insurance, and finance reforms in Turkey, the Turkish camp's reaction was, hold on a minute. We don't need to always implement your models. Why don't we work together to establish a technical university in Ankara instead, so we can educate our own international experts and begin to develop our own methods of housing and development and even expert knowledge in these fields. And that's where the title of the book, Landed Internationals, comes from. It refers to the emergence of a new type of expert during this particular moment of decolonization of power and knowledge through the establishment of peripheral nodes of knowledge production. As obvious as that might seem in hindsight, as the impetus for Methu's establishment, and as one of the beginnings of its activism, what is striking is that this idea is nowhere to be found in the documents associated with Methu's establishment. Instead, the idea is manifested in the relationships among the protagonists involved in the making of these projects. And this brings me to the methodology of the book. It's really during the work on this project that I came to the full realization that the archive or the documents are more like oracular texts. Like Pythia, the oracle of Delphi, they speak in tongues, and they tell us, and what they tell us cannot be taken literally. They require a good deal of disambiguation and interpretation. As the post-war historian and diplomat, and I think J.B. Jackson would relate to this as well, Edward Hallett Carr noted primary sources, even for instance, United Nations reports, did not reveal facts. They revealed, as Carr wonderfully put it here, quote, what the author of the document thought, what they thought had happened, what they thought ought to happen or would happen, or in Methu's case, what they wanted the UN to think that they thought, so that the UN would provide the necessary foreign currency for the project. For instance, if we look at the initial report by Charles Abrams, a New York labor lawyer and a UN housing expert, on the establishment of the school, Abrams writes, quote, Ankara itself, which hums with civil servants engaged in the nation's development, has no technical university in either engineering or architecture, so that the city in which policy is made for the whole country is an intellectual desert as far as architectural and planning talent is concerned, end quote. He continues, quote, 2 days ago, I made up my mind that Ankara must have a school of architecture and city planning, end quote. Making the argument that it was a lack of expertise that had necessitated the school, whereas the actual reason was that the Turkish bureaucrats simply demanded the establishment of a school as a prerequisite to their continued collaboration with the UN and the United Nations. UN and the United States. This interpretation is possible only through a process of recontextualization of the documents within the politics of their production. In the book, I refer to this process as an archaeology of encounters. It involves the unpacking of the diverging aims and agendas of the entities entangled in the conceptualization of a project, giving voice and agency to their contentious positionalities. Therefore, each of the 6 chapters of the book provides an episode in deconstructing and recontextualizing a key document related to the making of a post-war project. And this is really where the book contributes to post-colonial studies and becomes useful in the classroom. It decolonizes the archive and provides methodologies for deciphering post-war networks and projects of development. Starting with the Assam report in the first chapter titled Encounters in Housing and Land Economics, and the paradigm shift that ensues in the UN from policy development to training and education as found in the Abrams report, to the arrival of the University of Pennsylvania team in chapter 3, to formulate the initial curriculum of the school and the university. The book recontextualizes these primary sources by resituating them in the contentious environment that brought them about. Chapter 4 examines the spatialization of these ideas in the documents put together by the team of experts from the University of Pennsylvania School of Fine Arts. Here, we are back at that landscape we started with a different view produced by the UPenn experts. The Turkish administration appropriated close to 11,000 acres of what they refer to as underutilized farmland for the project. Now, that's an area I haven't been able to get into in terms of what the deeds that was appropriated for this project. The Penn team approached the organization of the site as a model development landscape, complete with a nuclear research and power generation site near the Lake Amer, towards the bottom of the screen here. Agricultural research areas, erosion control and reforestation sites, model villages, and social and technical research centers, and of course, an academic center that you see at the center of the screen. The Penn team positioned the academic center on a prominent hill overlooking Ankara and the Capitol complex and the ministries below. As you can probably guess, this wasn't going to go over well with the bureaucrats down below, but we'll get to that in a second. In this organization, the School of Architecture building, let me see if I can use my mouse. Oh yeah, okay. The School of Architecture building enjoyed the most prominent position at the edge of the hill. It was planned to be the initial building of the campus. The rest of the academic center was organized around a double axis, established first between the School of Architecture and the main library, and then turned slightly to align with the entrance drive and the School of Public Administration on the southeast. That's number one. The School of Arts and Sciences was located on the northwest, with engineering departments located down the slope with room for expansion. The Penn team called the quad, or the common space, right here, created by these departments, referred to it as a forum, creating a symbolic link between the social life of the campus and the idealized spaces and the models of citizenship in Roman cities. I think this was the Penn team's way of aligning Turkey with the constructed roots of Western civilization. As J.B. Jackson describes in his essay, A Pair of Ideal Landscapes, this was therefore a political landscape that sought to build particular habits of citizenship, collaboration, and socialization between these disciplines and the future managers of modernization in Turkey and beyond. However, as you might have guessed, the Turkish bureaucratic elite felt that the Penn team had gained too much control over the project and gradually pushed them from the driver's seat, if you will, but used their plans and recommendations as the program for the next competition for the campus site. In the process, they also moved the academic center to a site lower in elevation, which was deemed as the research centers down here in the previous plan, and closer to the governmental center of the capital. They strategically selected a young husband and wife firm of architects as the winner of the new competition, thinking that this would allow them to fully control the project. Something they didn't quite foresee was that Kemal Kurdaş, pictured here, the new Turkish president of the university, would take a special liking to the young architects, Altuğ and Behruz Çinici, so much so that the Ministry of Public Works was once again pushed to the margins. So you see the various rivalries both within and without that sort of begins to bring the project about here. The Çinici plan utilized many of the same principles established by the Penn team, but adapted them to the topography of the new site, elongating the forum, as you can see in this diagram, into what they eventually began to refer to as an alley. Along here, they're using the word forum initially. In the Çinici plan, a linear forum comprised the social and political armature of the university that you see rendered with the lines there. The main library took center stage right here, and the School of Architecture was once again on the north end, with the School of Public Administration The engineering departments were located to the south with, again, room for expansion. School of Arts and Sciences were right across from the library. The final chapter of the book, titled Stewards of the Land, explores how, for the next 9 years, while the Chinijis worked on the academic center, Kurdash took on the campus site, starting the largest reforestation project campaign that Turkey had seen to date, and winning for the landscaping of the campus the Aga Khan Award in 1997. Yeah. Here you see Sergeant Shriver on this picture on the upper left. Sergeant Shriver, the founding director of the American Peace Corps, diplomat and American ambassador to France later, is also participating in this tree planting activity. Kurdash had a way of, or a habit of bringing these visitors to campus to actually get involved in this planting and getting their hands dirty in the construction of the campus. In the process, Kurdash also began archaeological excavations on the campus site, so digging in a number of ways, and tying the new university and Turkey's heritage to pre-classical civilizations of Asia Minor and establishing the university's lineage to, quote, great civilizations of the past, end quote, but on his own terms, or the university's own terms. Therefore, every one of the ideas that Kurdash and the Chinijis were working with, including the reforestation project, had come from the initial plans of the Penn team. And every one of the new ideas they would implement around the campus would act as a model to be exported and expanded to other sites around Turkey, across the Mediterranean and the Middle East and beyond. Again, just as the Penn team had projected. However, during the implementation of these projects, something different began to take place at METU. Many of the projects that Kurdash was carrying out with students and his faculty were communal projects carried out on public land. These activities modeled a different type of citizenship and nationhood than was originally planned in the development models of the post-war period, resulting in the creation of a different type of political landscape and citizenship model for METU faculty and students. Again, in a pair of ideal landscapes, J.B. Jackson discusses Aristotle's conceptualization of the ideal citizen as a farmer. He writes that the farmer, because of his work outdoors, was likely to be a good soldier, strong and inured to hardship. The family-sized farm produced men who were not only physically, but also mentally qualified to serve as soldiers, for they were usually steady, methodical, and little given to political agitation. This was also the ideal adopted by the colonial settler ideology of men, such as Thomas Jefferson, modeling the idea of the gentleman farmer at Monticello, and the idea of the landowner as the only upright citizen. Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie Home and later Usonian House can be seen as attempts at making this model available to a broader consumer market. Post-war models of modernization and development, both at home and abroad, sought to extend that same model of citizenship through the idea of the detached single-family home. In the process of the exportation, just wrapping up here, of these exportation of these ideas to the world, something went awry at METU. Well, first of all, METU was never supposed to happen. The Assam report was supposed to happen, and the detached single-family home with 30-year mortgages tied to American finance. And then when METU happened, even with its forum and all, it ended up producing a different model, citizen, farmer, soldier, and nationhood than was originally intended. The roots of METU's activism and models of citizenship can certainly be traced to the rivalry and the contentious politics of the post-war era, but is also a product of the making and remaking of this particular landscape. Much of the existing scholarship on modernization theory and development treats post-war projects as products of monolithic, hegemonic ideologies carried forward largely by Western actors and networks. With the landed internationals, I sought to point to a particularly productive instance during the Cold War, where there were significant contentions and deformations in the implementation of such ideals through the involvement of different agents and agencies, and ultimately producing alternative political landscapes in the shape of a university campus. Thank you very much.
Right. If, yeah, I'm okay. He's gonna bring back the microphone, but I was gonna ask if everyone could hear me and I'll just do it without it. But maybe it's better for, it's so loud now. Let's see, here we go. I speak very loudly. Is that really loud? Is that okay? Yeah? Cool, okay. Maybe it means I can go away. All right. Yes, cool. Thank you so much. This is for those who are students considering a future in this field, I would say that this is the epitome of a hard act to follow. And coming third after at least a pair of wonderful talks is not easy. And so thank you for staying with us and for cutting me some slack. I also really want to thank Professor Gonzalez, Professor Kambich, the prize committee, and the University of New Mexico. It's wonderful to be here. I think this is I'd never heard of a event like this, and now that I'm here, I think it's really terrific. And I also was just really pleased to be included in this, not only because it's very nice to have one's work recognized, but the idea that my work would be recognized for its potential contribution to design and for design students with that conversation seemed really just very surprising and important for me. I'm trained as an art historian and a bit of a autodidact in landscape history. Not so much a bit, and really an autodidact. And for me, the work of J.B. Jackson was very, very important for me when I was first sort of starting to read in this field. I was writing my dissertation in part at Dunbar and Oaks, and had sort of been come there and pitched myself as a garden historian. And what I realized in reading Jackson was that I really wanted to be a landscape historian. I wasn't clear on what that was, but that was really what I was after. And as others mentioned, as Barack particularly mentioned, I think that certain core ideas of Jackson's, though my work itself is quite far away from his, obviously, remain very important. And particularly among those is the idea that we not only need to see landscape as something we see as a way of seeing, but as a real space, that we needed to do landscape history that connected the visual and the experiential and the spatial, and that those needed to be in dialogue with one another. And I think that in my book, that's proved to be a sort of central driving concept. I am including a photo of the covers because that seemed like the way you were supposed to start. Also because I just really think, I think I was blessed with two very nice covers. That's not a humble brag, that's just a brag. But also I really, really like the cover of the Chinese book, which is sort of crazy. And so anyway, I offer that as a place to start. So thank you all for coming today. My book ostensibly discusses a imperial garden in northeastern China called Bishu Shanzhuang, or the mountain villa to escape the heat. It is a garden of roughly 1,400 acres intramurally, and then quite a bit more space extramurally. You can see the mural in question, the wall, sort of running here. It's most obvious here, and then it runs around here. Can you see the mouse? Yeah, you can. Okay, cool. And then sort of hitches over here and then comes down. And you see that it incorporates a significant mountainous area, as well as a somewhat flat plain area, a series of lakes, and then a palace down here, the palace area down here, which is not so visible in Google Earth. And it is a sort of complex landscape, both in its own right and relative to garden practices in China. in that it is conventionally thought, I think, that Chinese gardens, the Chinese urban gardens particularly, the leading design constraint of Chinese gardens is supposedly space, and how Chinese architects used extreme urban constraints, spatial constraints, to create special effects. This garden is interesting in many respects, but one of them is the way it continues to either utilize or evoke analogs to these sort of effects, these spatial effects, when in fact space is not a constraint in any way at all. If anything, the sort of wide open vistas begin to realize the Chinese ideal of a blurring between the real world and the garden, or garden without walls, so to speak. The garden sits, is here, or I shouldn't call it a garden, the park, let's say, in the pre-modern city of Rehe, which is now known as Chengde. And you can see that it's particularly proximate to Beijing, the Qing capital, and then which is in the relatively northern part of China, or the Qing territory. The garden was built over the course of the 18th century by two Qing emperors. We'll get to them in just a second. But we should start with a brief introduction to the Qing, I think, which is to say that the Qing was the last of China's imperial dynasties, was crucially what is sometimes called a conquest dynasty, which is to say that it was ruled by people, the Manchus, as well in cooperation with Mongols and also Chinese who were living in border regions. It was a Manchu regime, and the Manchus are from northeast China, Dongbei, literally in Chinese called the Northeast, which is up here, not quite to Korea, which is this area here. And they came across the Great Wall, conquered first so-called China proper, which is the territory roughly of the Ming Dynasty and of China going back to roughly the Han, or about the time of Christ, give or take. And you can see where China proper is because it's the most densely articulated portion of this early 18th century atlas. But they also combined that over time with many, many other territories. The Northeast, or Manchu territory, Mongolia, which is in this area, and then later on, areas that are much more familiar to us over the course of the 18th century in thinking about the modern state of the People's Republic of China, including Tibet and Xinjiang province, or the Western provinces, the Western territories. And so the last thing I'd say about that, besides to sort of foreground the idea that territorially and geographically the Qing combined lots of different spaces, is that you'll see that Rehe, somewhat critically, is on the other side of the Great Wall from Beijing. Like the Manchus themselves, Rehe came from outside China and is in fact in Inner Mongolia. And so it represents a place where Qing emperors left the capital for up to 6 months each year, and where they engage particularly with non-Chinese or non-China proper parts of their constituencies. It was a place of multi-ethnic meeting and of multi-ethnic governance, as we'll see. It was built primarily and used, frankly, primarily by these two emperors, the Kangxi Emperor on your left and the Qianlong Emperor on your right. Who also, coincidentally, I guess, were the two longest lived and longest ruling emperors in Chinese history. They ruled over the Qing for almost the entire period between 1660 and the end of the 18th century, with only a brief period where Kangxi's son and Qianlong's father, the Yongzheng Emperor, ruled. And they were invested very deeply in this form of multi-ethnic emperorship that characterized the Qings, in which they sought to form a type of pan-Asian emperorship that existed particularly at Rehe, among other places. The book itself, and in thinking about what I wanted to say today in my brief time, I wanted to focus particularly on some methodological issues that I thought might be of interest or relevance to students thinking about the history and design of landscape. And the book is animated in part by a basic historiographic problem, which is that historically the study of the Qing has been dominated by the study of Qianlong, the guy on the right. And the reason for that is fairly straightforward. The archive is massive and it's fairly accessible. And once you speak Manchu, which is a relatively recent thing in Chinese studies, it becomes widely available, it's well published, et cetera, et cetera. And the archive for Kangxi, for reasons I don't immediately have time to say, is very, very small. And so the result is that although you have a garden that's built over the course literally of 80 years, that has fires and neglect in the middle of it, it's built up, all of this. When I started this project in my dissertation, what I had for a map was this. And this is a very useful map. It was done immediately in the wake of Mao's death, Chairman Mao's death in the early 1980s, as part of a restoration and archaeology project at the site. It's sort of accurate in a certain number of ways. It's sort of inaccurate in some ways that you can figure out, but it's fine. But it has all the buildings. It's quite useful. The problem is it compresses 100 years of development and use into a single image that has no differentiation. So the core question that became to drive my project in a certain way was, how do we recover Kangxi? How do we recover the early phases of development of this guy on the left from the overlaying and the rebuilding and the sort of textual flood of the guy on the right? And the core, therefore, and with that come, I should say, a lot of other sort of larger questions that maybe we could talk about in the roundtable around canon and canon formation. How do large historical narratives get written? How do smaller narratives get overwritten? I think that as we think, and Barak mentioned how his method thinks about decolonizing the archive, as we think about decolonization and colonization, it's important to think, I feel, about both at our fields level and at global levels as decolonization like a set of Russian nesting dolls. You may think you're looking at the sort of outermost doll or the innermost doll, but there are ones on both sides. And just as surely as Chinese architecture or Chinese history exists within one position within our field, it also has its own canons and its own forms of colonization, many of which are present here as well. So anyway, so the central project, one of the central research projects of the book is the construction of what I called the Bishushanzhuang historical GIS, which allowed the creation of numerous maps that I hope would restore some sense of temporal stratigraphy, allow us to see the different layers of construction and development at the site, of which you can see pieces here. And what I really want to emphasize is that when you look at this map, you see, well, you kind of see, oh, you do actually see quite easily on such a huge screen, all these buildings. You think, oh, there's a lot of buildings, which is true. The answer is there is something like 1,000 buildings in the individual buildings in the site. So yeah, there are a lot of buildings. But when you go back and now you look at this and you take all the buildings that are this sort of mustard color and you cause them to go away, the result is that when you think about what Kangxi's site is versus what Qianlong's site is, you have an architecturally much more sparse site, a much more physically constrained site, and a site indeed that with further research, we can begin to break down into several different phases. Which is perhaps most clearly defined by the expansion of the site to the southeast, the construction of several lakes, which were essentially a practical concession to the fact that the southeast of the site, trapped between these lakes and this river, had turned into a floodplain, and I suspect it was just a mess, and so they dredged it and expanded the lake system, and also the building of palaces that allowed for a more permanent imperial presence at the site. Some of the other things I was very interested in trying to look at had to do with experience and how we can understand the experience of the site for which we have very, very few records. One of the most important documents we have, and when I say very few records, both my colleagues talked about very archivally rich projects. If I isolate myself to the Kangxi period archive, I have maybe 15 documents and a handful of paintings. And so what I have to do is figure out how to extract Kangxi pieces, both from Qianlong documents and later documents, and also then use what I have in the site to try to expand what information I get from very few documents. If I have a document that talks about hydrology and hydrological engineering, I really have to sort of put that into the place and then read it more fully, because the document itself doesn't give me very much information. So one of the most important documents for me was a brief account, 3 or 4 pages, by an official named Zhang Yishu, who visited the site at the end of the first phase of construction in 1708 and described 2 tours that he was given by the emperor, that he and a number of other officials were given, led personally by the emperor. And you can see those tours mapped in purple and pink on this map on the left. And what we see is, in the first instance, is a form of emperorship that is hinging substantially on a type of hospitality and a type of interpersonal intimacy or connection, a sort of elision of hierarchies that is made possible directly by the landscape itself. A type of intimacy or connection that would be impossible in the architectural hierarchies of the Forbidden City, which, if you've never been, is this sort of grand hierarchical site that literally rises, not only progresses along a sort of straight axis, but rises in height as you go up towards the ritual center of the palace and then back down towards the rear gate. And so it's entirely built around centering the emperor's sort of superiority. Whereas the garden becomes for the Qing, or the landscape becomes for the Qing, a site of more intimate level relations in forms of things like touring or hunting or feasting, all of which are made possible by the flexible arrangements of the garden. What we also see in Zhang Yishu's, or what I think we see in the garden in its early phase is through Zhang Yishu's tour, is a division between private and public spaces, or so-called public spaces. A core area in the center, which is the space for this hospitality, and then a progression towards more private reserved spaces where the emperor lives, or where he and his wives live, those being basically the only people who live within the garden, the emperor and his wives. And so this sort of division of the garden changes somewhat. Well, it also underlines its differences to the Forbidden City, which also has a division between public and private, but not organized in this precise way. This is quite different. Thinking about Zhang Yishu's tour, we can also think again about the role of water and of experience. One of the things that quite struck me was that when we look at this map, or frankly, when you go to the site today, what you do is you focus on the roads that you walk along, the paths that you walk along. You can't take boats very easily. There are little paddle boats, but the lakes are really a mess and it's really hot and you don't really want to do that. And so you focus really on the idea that they're paths. And then here, there's no bridge here, but now, for instance, but now there's a really big bridge. And so when you get to the end of this island, you don't have to backtrack all the way back down to get off of it. You just cross the bridge and you continue on your way. But of course, in Zhang Yishu's time, there is no such bridge. And boats in this central area not only become a sort of practical utility, but also a great source of pleasure. And as I looked further through images, through pictorial documents and other sites, I realized that actually at least the central part of the garden was very much shaped by the experience of being on the water. Not only was the garden designed to move around by boat, but also many of the sort of scenic sites, the scenic experiences that were built into the garden's design were intended to be appreciated from the water, that they worked visually from the level of sitting in a boat, and not in the same way from an elevated bank or from a viewing pavilion set 15 meters back from the edge of the water or whatever, which would naturally change your perspective. I also was able to think some about the hydrology and the way the hydrology of the site relates to architecture. Now the mountainous section is quite dry. There are a few natural springs that are nice to drink from on a hot day, but it is mostly quite dry. Yet water, at least visually, in terms of the pictures that we have of the site, appears very prominently. And how that water was managed, how it was controlled, probably through cisterns and controlled releases, as well as perhaps springs that have dried up, proved to allow us to think in new ways about certain sensory qualities of the site, the way in which the sound of water or the sight of water or the coolness provided by water all complement other aspects of the site's use. I have no idea. Can you tell me just how I remember? I've gone 10 or I have 10. I have used 10. I better pick up the pace. One of the things that I also, so in any case, these are some of the insights that were gleaned by this sort of effort to try to recover function. But connected to this very much was the idea of the relationship between landscape and its representation, the physical site and how it was pictured, and which I mentioned earlier in the context of J.B. Jackson, and also extending from that, the way in which we could understand landscape as a medium, which is a term or an idea sort of coined by W.J.T. Mitchell, the art historian W.J.T. Mitchell, who thinks of landscape as a medium. But Mitchell is really focused on pictorial landscape. When he says landscape, he's talking about landscape painting. And he's specifically talking about 19th century landscape painting in either a European academic or post-academic style. And so the way in which landscape forms the dream work of imperialism and colonialism for Mitchell is about the way in which places like the Australian landscape are reframed through the practices of British landscape painting. I wanted to extend that idea to think about landscape as a medium, specifically a medium like oils, but not like oils in the terms of its representation, but rather the idea that in landscape, I as a designer, as an architect, as a builder, as an emperor, have raw materials in which I can not only create something that serves as a setting for my authority, but also that actually is a physical representation of my authority, that is an instantiation of my authority, that is, to borrow Louis Marin's expression, or to distort Louis Marin's expression, the landscape of the emperor is the emperor, was the idea that I was eventually trying to articulate. And thinking about the ways in which all of these things come together. So what I want to spend for a couple of minutes doing is talking about the ways in which the landscape of Bishu Shandong was related to different types of landscapes from which it drew meaning through comparison or analogy or borrowing. But then think about all those analogs, all those connections as things that were constituted within the Qing, that defined the Qing and defined Qing authority. So one of those I mentioned already was the idea of the Qing territory as this multi-ethnic state. This place that drew together the geographies and territories of lots and lots of different people and created of them an empire that was somehow itself distinct and cohesive. These were particularly connected, of course, in one sense, to the Northeast, to the territory where the Manchus were from, and their sort of mythic ancestral home of Mount Changbai, and how it connects through various types of geomantic energy to Mount Changbai. It also was connected, however, to early Chinese practices of understanding the imperial retreat as a site of escape. This is a probably 12th century painting on the right, but depicting an after composition probably of the Tang Dynasty, so circa the 8th or 9th century. And you can see many compositional similarities between these two palaces. On the left, we haven't talked about this painting on the left. On the left is one of my very few documents, a painting by Lung Mang, a Qing court painter of the site circa 1709, which proved to be a very important source for me. It also was depicted in forms that were related to contemporary pictorial debates around idealized landscape in the brush of Wang Yanqi, and also historic practices of being a private garden owner. On the right, Wang Yanqi depicts the Tang garden depicted in a long-standing album series called 10 Views of a Thatched Hut, or 10 Records of a Thatched Hut. But you can see that on the left, the images depicting Bishu Shandong on the left share many of the compositional affinities, and clearly this was a way of depicting the contemporary garden in an ancient, in an early form. The garden was also connected to physical landscapes within China, particularly, especially the landscape of West Lake, a very famous scenic site in Hangzhou, in the south of China. And there are elements on the left, you can see there are elements of Bishu Shanzhuang that were explicitly designed to evoke West Lake. Bishu Shanzhuang was also enmeshed, however, in global networks. The same views that I've been showing on the left, for instance, the woodblock prints, were also recreated, so to speak, in the medium of copper plate engraving by a missionary, an Italian missionary named Matteo Ripa, who was resident in the court. The painting that I showed a moment ago, Lung Mei's, has many connections to both Chinese and European painting, but one of its obvious links may be to an unexpected source, a 16th century map from Civitas Orbis Terrarum, or a whole series of maps, but a common European map composition that you can see here in this view of Besançon on the right. And you'll notice that these are similar not only in their framing of mountains on the left and right, also in their palette. This is a very Chinese palette, but it's similar here. But even in Besançon, the ostensible vanishing point for the viewer, the pseudo-perspectival vanishing point, is a mountain here at the center. And actually, there's a mountain right there that is also the vanishing point of this. It's difficult to know whether or not Lung Mei would have seen this particular painting or this particular map, but there are clear compositional similarities. And indeed, Lung Mei's painting was constructed in a way that unfortunately I don't quite have time to explain for a minute, but was constructed not only relying on things like the Tang painting that I showed a minute ago, Emperor Minghong's journey into Shu, but also through the use of, at the time, state-of-the-art surveying techniques brought from Europe that allowed, and it's possible to show that Lung Mei's, particularly his arrangement of the buildings on his site, relied on trigonometric surveying, and that resulted also in some curious distortions to the painting relative to the real site. So what does all this add up to? I want to end just very quickly on a pair of paintings of Kangxi himself. Of Kangxi, the landscape that he was trying to build, the emperor who was trying to depict himself in the landscape of Bishu Shanzhuang. And here we have a painting on the left of Kangxi reading a book, as you can see, and also on the right of Kangxi reading a book that are very similar, but have some clear distinctions. The one on the left, they're probably both done by Europeans working in the court. The one on the left certainly relies on a form of perspective, but also we would think looks more Chinese in the sense that the materials, at least, ink and pigments on silk are indeed Chinese materials. It's also mounted as a hang scroll, a large scroll that hangs on the wall. And so here it combines in one certain way the sort of all-encompassing nature and the, if not global, then the trans-Eurasian connectivity of the site. On the right, we have a painting, maybe even by the same painter, in fact, a man named Giovanni Gherardini, that is mounted as a table screen, but takes a very European format and genre, a sort of intimate portrait set in an oval to depict the Qing emperor. It's done in oils on paper, which is, paper was the typical support for oil painting in the Qing court by Europeans. And it represents him in a way that is very, very similar. Again, seated as a book, but wholly different in its idiom. This is not a person seated cross-legged on a prayer mat or a meditation mat, but instead a person seated in a chair with the book open on the lap in a very European manner of reading. And what I'm trying to say in this last slides, is really the notion of a form of emperorship that is, on the one hand, constructed from a Qing perspective. This is not a connected emperorship that is defined by Europeanness, but is instead one defined by centering in China or in the Qing. And that in this book and in this site is really expressed first and foremost through landscape and sort of the performance of emperorship in space, as well as in this case, in reading. So thank you very much. I look forward to having you.
Thank you all so much. Those were really, really enjoyable lectures. Let's just take a moment and we'll bring out some chairs and we can all sit down. So if you all want to formulate questions in your heads or stretch your legs momentarily, we'll just reset through. Oh, sure. I do want to remind everyone that after the Q&A session, we'll have books for everyone and have a chance for the authors to sign them if we have time. Oh, thanks. So do you want to see if we'll change the perspective? Okay. Oh, great. Oh, please turn it. Awesome. So then we get some light.
This is a question for Hera. So this is an area of intersection or of people that I some of the West, Utah, New Mexico, or not West, I had no idea existed. And I appreciate you being able to write about these families and share a little bit of their experience. I was curious if you had any interaction with people who live in these cottages today. Do you have any experience interacting with them, and if they knew about the history behind these places that they live in?
Sure, don't feel bad. I'm from Louisiana and I had no idea about these people either. And that was part of my journey to learning about not only Creole architecture and development architecture in New Orleans and more ways about families in particular. I do know one homeowner who actually in Wisconsin, who lives in one of the Dolio cottages on St. Philip Street. These are everyday houses. There's still lots of everyday people living in the French Quarter, just for example. And then a lot of the houses in New Orleans is actually working to change some of the laws, especially in places like the French Quarter, where a lot of these houses are Airbnb kind of properties and people are renting them out, so they're not permanent residences. But they're in a way that you might not expect, still very comfortable kind of places in which to dwell. One thing that is not discussed so much, that even in many of these field cottages, and I do touch upon this in particular examples, but some of these houses, which are the 4-bay cottages, were actually multi-family residences. So you might have one family living in one half, and another family living in another half. That wasn't necessarily the case with the houses in which the Royals lived and many of their peers in the city. But people still enjoy living in those houses and done a fantastic job, especially if you're talking about the French Quarter and Quebec. There's a lot of places get tourist activity as well, who live in them and enjoy them. One of the houses that I didn't go into detail on by Norbert Soulier was a house that he actually had designed for his aunt, also in the French Quarter, a bit more classical detailing. He's trying to do with interesting to see in a contemporary perspective what the house looked like, because I talked about this one townhouse was not for sale that house, has been divided into apartments. It was actually the upper level on the attic, basically, that was for sale as an apartment, so separate dwellings, so kind of bringing back that multi-family or multiple individual style of living, which would have been very prevalent in Southern America.
Yeah, that's sort of a follow-up to that. Like we learn a lot about like one generation versus generation living. And I think you mentioned like some of these families would build houses for their brothers and children. I thought that was really interesting, something I never heard of. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Sure, we have the Doleos and the CA not doing this, and what's so amazing to me is learn that there are any number of individuals and families, and maybe, people who don't have the skill of building, they have other professions and businesses that they're thinking, but they're hiring their neighbors and their friends to engage in this kind of building for them, and therefore creating, like I said, their own birthright, developing generational wealth until you get to a period in Southern history where that wealth is, others are finding ways to take away that wealth and that property ownership. But you have this, from the French and Spanish colonial times in the city, people of color amassing property and working for one another in this way on significant levels. And just immediately as I pursued research on the CBA and the Doleos family, I could have done similar research on any number of individuals or families to show that slide with all those other names at the end. And for me, it would be interesting and rewarding and would take many lifetimes to pursue this kind of, take that methodology and apply it to other families and individuals. But again, you have this entire history of Louisiana and New Orleans, and when we know about New Orleans architecture and Creole architecture, and just the significant way in which the Jean but really were part of that process of the development of the city when it's that wonderful urban environment that we know today is phenomenal.
Can I just follow up on that question? I'm just curious, sorry, I'm just curious about when you think about how, I think it was starting as Creole architecture, or the architecture that you're studying comes into being, how it relates to different places. I was struck that you had mentioned that one of the families had long had it in the plan to go to Paris or to go back to Paris or whatever preposition you might like to use. And what you just described, that sort of building, generational building, is was common in lots of architectures that involve terrace homes, for instance, the Dutch, but also in and French and maybe, but also in places in the colonies, so to speak, where they go. And so I wonder whether, or I guess it's in a sort of very simple sense, to what degree that practice relates to French practices of building families versus African or Afro-Caribbean practices, and so, but also more complexity, what it tells us about what family organization or architectural organization might tell us about, the conceptions of home and where. Because I for one was sort of surprised to see, oh, this family always sort of saw this as just a sort of economic venture to go somewhere else, as opposed to sort of saying, I'm investing in the community that is the place that is mine.
I mean, that's interesting for me too, because while the CAs were there, New Orleans was their home. And it wasn't until, and I think I had acquired that particular document before, and then kind of standing for certain things. And I was actually maybe the third or fourth or even fifth time and honed in on that one line. And that really changed things in a way for me. But it was really important for this idea of establishment of home, especially because by the time we get to the Doleos siblings and the Suge siblings that I focused on, in the one or two generations before their parents or grandparents, either the women in those families had been enslaved. And it was really the women, some folks that, well, what about the women in these families? Well, obviously the traditional methods of developing professions, the women aren't the builders, but they were building in other ways. by acquiring property, not just via their counterparts, but also through by themselves or inheriting property from other women of color or even from other from their female enslavers, for example, which is fascinating to me, creating this idea of not just home but place within the city, especially in the city that was very increasingly unfriendly towards people of color, free or not. Was vastly interesting and to see how that they carried over, especially in the post-violent era, and even as the city began to leave the city and ultimately left the city. And I encountered one thing that I didn't get to talk about in the lecture was, you know, I have no physical portraits of what the building was like, except for that house they serve as those portraits for me, and it was Sweet family member who contacted me because he found my education online. So thank you to the library. But he contacted me and said, hey, and so you know, we've been working together basically kind of filling these gaps on what happened to the family when they left, and you know, why would they use that home to create another home? Where now the current family members, their descendants, you know, don't really have an understanding of what their role was in the city of New Orleans. So for the Doleos, there's been much more continuity. Less so, it's interesting because between the Doleos, the family's still there, but there's less of a connection to that place. And I feel like in the city, even though their family was departed.
Yes.
Well, what a wonderful set of talks, individually and together. They're really stimulating. And so I'm thinking some new thoughts, and I'm going to try to grow and express those. And I'll apologize if they're not entirely clear. But one thing that I think unifies these are you're using traditional sources, you know, documents, portraits, paintings, but you're all using, well, Jackson's expanded sense of landscape as not just the view and representation, but the physical landscape. And you know, which of course includes buildings as well as, you know, rural landscapes. And so you're dealing in non-verbal culture, you know, our education, our scholarship are all predicated on verbal culture, you know, the documents and the way you write a book or the way we have our discussion here. But you know, since this school has, you know, designers, planners, you know, either already practicing or trained to do that, we're dealing with the non-verbal parts of culture in the work here. And you're producing a history which is using the traditional documentation, but adding this spatial component. And one of the things that seems to me that the written documents and even the paintings and portraits, people know what they mean and they know how to express themselves in those. In a sense, there's a kind of surface meaning that's more obvious in those. When you get into spatial culture and move beyond the physical environment to how people move and how they take a tour in the garden, how they use the spaces in the Creole cottages. You know, it becomes even more complex, and you're working towards that, and that's one of the great things about scholarship in, you know, in recent generations, especially this generation of scholarship. So that's my building it, you know, trying to understand how these pieces fit together. So then I guess my question is, how do you think it'll work in those terms, and think of the landscape, the buildings, the objects as offering another, and in some ways, and less censored or less controlled manifestation of the culture than the documents and the traditional material? I think that makes some kind of sense to connect with what your, you know, what your work is.
Yeah, I think any of you could take that on if you'd like.
Well, so the
the building as a primary source for the landscape. Yeah, I think I'll speak for the ways that I was working. In the way that I tried to today talk about the building. I didn't talk about it very much in terms of its materiality, its particular physical organization so much, but in a way that it's sort of the culture that exists within that institution, and try to substantiate that through the way that landscape came about, what kind of activities took place, and it's making both politically in terms of these various actors that were working together, but also had diverging ideas about what this institution should be, what ideas of citizenship and nationhood would be, but the kind team had their own version of it, and then that changed and adapted and reformed, if you will, and doing something else. And I think so. I think the transformations of the building, the way it's used, and the way that landscape was constructed based on certain master plans, but through different types of needs and formal financing, international borrowing strategies and so on. Instead, it was kind of a grassroots types of efforts that emerged for the movement of that landscape. I think I was kind of looking at the ways that the plans were altered, essentially, and what kind of politics and relationships went into altering what the documents say. It's the lived landscape for building that I think informed the way that I was using, working with this traditional source of the document, the building and primary source, but also paying attention to it's appropriate. Within the requirements of their meeting, I think that kind of sums up the book. I mean, there are other sources that I look at where it's of course the husband and wife firm changing are borrowing still, even when they're conceptualizing the school of architecture. They rely greatly on, for instance, ritualism or that structuralism. Those are very recognizable things. And I do, of course, talk about that in the book, but I think for me that was a important lesson from this story.
It's a really rich example of that post-World War II paradox of countries embracing, I'll call it senile modernism in planning and architecture as a route to expressing their new national identities. So Yugoslavia, Brazil come immediately to mind, but it's very strong case study of the local imprint and how it comes to the board.
If I can start, I think for me, the question was like my kind of question. I think that as my talk today sort of maybe demonstrated deep down, my book is really about methodology, and sometimes I really have to work very hard to sort of get a history that I'm not so easily interested in someone besides me. And part of that is a sort of art historian nationalism or interdisciplinarianism, which is to say that I think that that art historians and maybe landscape historians too have been often set aside by real historians who have been good at stereotypes and who also will bring out images as illustrations of their argument, but don't view images as or landscapes as sources, pieces, etc. And they absolutely are. And indeed, they're in some ways quite complex because they communicate, but the code by which they communicate are especially as we move away in time, increasingly not necessarily lost, but attenuated, right? I mean, what we think is the way an 18th century Chinese person saw a painting is now, we're now 250 years separate. And we have to sort of reconstruct that how we see it and know it, just as surely as Jackson was trying to do for mid-century landscape. And so I think that part of it really wanting to sort of say art history is, or landscape history is history that has special tools and special questions and special methods that allow it to engage sources that are outside of the traditional historians, and was something that I feel quite strongly about. I also think that one of the things that motivated, so I showed briefly that that map of the geometric vein that connected Shanghai, Mount Shanghai, to the river and the rest of the empire. And that was a map that first came out of the text. So in one of the key texts that I had that described the emperor describing this sort of sacred geography of the East. And it was filled with place names. And I just didn't know what any of these places were. But some of them had been trained in, they were China proper art history. These were all Manchu and Georgian places, Northeastern places, Mongolian places. They sounded really funny, they were wrong, they were syllables, none of them meant anything to me, I didn't know what they were. And so I went out and found, and thankfully Mongol places in particular have been fairly stable from the Qings now. And so if you're using Chinese transliterations of names, you can often find them simply by using Google Earth, which is very lots of, and then you can figure out what the pre-modern means are, whatever. And so I was very interested in reconstructing this geography using Google Earth. Similarly, all the work on hydrology at the site began with a single document that described the technical problem of the site's rather complex hydrological system, for which there are no other documents, where there's very little design physical evidence that you can really make much sense of. But this document described the problem of the emperor was there too long of a year, and the hydrology would silt up. And then by the time, and they couldn't do anything about it because he was there, so they couldn't really fix it. By the time he left, the whole place has been covered with ice because it was too late in the year. I mean, it came back too early in the year, so it hadn't really fully defrosted. So they had this sort of compounding problem of a silted up hydrological system. Now, none of that meant anything to me until I started to look at where they were talking on. And in both these cases, what I mean is that I think that the text, often text and images both, are intended to be read by the original audience with certain amounts of embodied knowledge of space. If you're a garden, if you're the guy who maintains the emperor's garden, you know about the site. So I say, oh, you know, the fourth shoe sock is all dredged up, and you say, oh yeah, I know what that is. I'll go fix it. But now, as a historian, I've got to recover that knowledge. And the way I chose to do it was through mapping, and sort of recreating the garden so that I can put these places back in space and think about where they are. And then the last thing I just say really quickly is your question also, this is something I thought about, or I've been sort of denying myself. Obviously a lot, not all of my work, but a lot of the work is built on a data. It's built on extracting knowledge, trying to extract knowledge from the landscape in ways that are analogous to the way you extract knowledge from information from the document, right? The document says X, Y, and Z, then you put it in a database and it's all very same. But there's something, for me, it is somewhat parallel between the document and the database. The database is just the extraction of that information, places, and whatever. I in some way, the transformation of the landscape into a database, though it's central to the project, also represents a you make up a word that I don't know to defuzzifying. One of the things I like about images and landscapes is that they're high open to interpretation. Documents are too, it's a little less obvious, but you can read a landscape, you can read it. And there is in that move to the database, the implication But now the knowledge is all there, and it's all knowable, it's all around the box in the video. And I just would say that I think one of the that work really hard on is we're repuzzling, if you will, using the word of the videos, to try to make sure that I haven't made it all to on off black white 1-0. Whether I was reintroducing some possibility for interpretation of the video back in the week.
I kind of a connected question and sort of related to what Chris is asking about, maybe the non-material, like the experience. I'm thinking of the material alternatives, least material sense, like the nod or the wink or the, you know, the other thing that's there that exists and that's understood if you're part of that culture. So how did you handle, or how did you handle, not a nice word, how did you deal with language, the conventional language, but also reading text that would have meant something entirely different? I'm thinking like even when I'm reading, you know, really old Spanish, if the words were just understood in a completely different way, and I have to read other text to understand what I'm really reading. So how did you get into that?
I mean, that's right, completely me. I think much the way that you do with Old Spanish, which is to say 18th century Chinese is not 21st century Chinese, and my late 20th century Chinese is pretty good. My 21st century Chinese is pretty poor, actually. But my 18th century Chinese is, and 17th century and 16th century, that's all okay. And so I did a lot of work along that. I also rely on, I'm not a professional translator, and so in places where I could, I certainly relied on people whose translation was much better. But I think that for me also, I took a very, in the sense that also what I was trying to do was understand reading practices or language practices that weren't just sexual but also visual. I think that I don't know, I recently had a colleague say to me, we were reading a Chinese scholar, say to me, you look at paintings in really funny ways. I think she said really interesting ways, but what she really meant was really strange ways. And I just think that we need to try to be experimental and thoughtful about how we approach these documents. Not because we are going to be attached to any one meaning documents, make up meaning, but because sometimes it requires some fishing around away from what our teachers taught us to find the way I look at painting. Some of the ideas I have about paintings are not the way I was taught to do it. And they may be right, they may be wrong. I would like to think they're more right than wrong, but they are worth a try and see what results they get. I mean, the first time I presented the research on Monday, we connected to surveying. I was basically, maybe this is an Australian expression, I was shirt fronted outside the panel at the College Bar Association by a colleague who said, that can't be right. And I said, no, I'm pretty sure that it is. And it just, I think, requires thinking outside. I mean, it sounds sort of like, you know, patting myself on the back, and maybe it is, but I really think that creativity, that spending a lot of time looking at things, and just a lot of time until they start to, what I would think of as sort of come upon. Until they stop being seductive and smooth and easy. One way is seductive and smooth and pretty, but when you look at it long enough, it starts, the cracks between it start to come apart, and that's where I want to go. I want to find those cracks and go into them.
I would actually argue that all three of you do that, and with your own types of documents. That there's looking at the bunch of photo, you know, you could really look at that for quite a long time, or like understanding the Sanford maps and the changes from the property shifts from ownership. That there's something deeper if you don't look at it for a long time, and maybe that's part of our design education, and that we are accustomed, or our historian education is to be accustomed to look until we start understanding where the cracks are, or where those things right in front of our face that we're not seeing yet are. I don't know if either of you would like to elaborate as well. You don't have to.
I mean, I think It's funny because somebody, asked me once, well, what is your methodology? I don't have a methodology, but then, I thought it was just right? But then I do, and it's like, oh, and it's interesting because our topics and our subject matter is very different. But the manner in which, we think about these documents and many of which are, documents and archives people know about, they've accessed and used them umpteen times before, but it's that practice of looking at something and taking it apart, not necessarily knowing how it's gonna come back together. And I did a an art history background too, so maybe it's something about databases, but for me, it's like this ginormous spreadsheet, actually with several spreadsheets. And so this kind of started for me in considering Creole architecture in New Orleans in general, and what that meant. But then there's a series called the New Orleans Architecture Series. And the way that it explores architecture in the city is via different geographic areas of the city. And when I first started to research for people of color, I basically went through several of these volumes, and every reference that they had to a free person of color as a builder, as a property owner, put them in this spreadsheet. And that's how I started making some of these early notices, saying, oh, well, half of the references are to the Dolio, and the other half is to the Sudan. And so what does that mean for this? And then being able to research those families in particular, looking at the properties, and of course, a lot of the property that they own, something else is built on it, something that they built is not there at all. So you don't always have the material thing, but then you have contracts in some cases, deed transactions and other things, probate records in particular that you're looking at, and there are things that other people have, they're reading those documents in a way that others have not, in order to bring this information. So for me, it was a combination of, just the spatial methodology, but also really architecture for people, right? And so thinking about the people who inhabit and build these spaces in a very specific way, which is not only how I got a lot of this information in my approach to the families in particular, comparing them to other younger communities, those who were native to New Orleans, those who were coming from Saint Domingue and other places, the white Creole American architects who were coming into the city as well. And it's really how I began to approach a lot of my research and teaching in architectural history, period of my history in general, by thinking of the constituents and how they're engaging with space, how they're creating and manipulating space. And then sometimes you might have the same set of sources, but the questions that arise based on which constituents or communities you're looking at will determine, the sort of order, the method that you put, and how you approach those sources and what you're looking for.
I'm sorry, did you want to speak?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Your question. I think one of the things that helped me a lot, in dealing with the record, and whether they are the primary sources of the spaces that we're looking at, or a particular image, whether it's the photograph or the plan, or a rendering with the relation to the studio and so on. Reading the tours, ideas about concepts help me a lot, because if we look at these documents were moving from one entity to another, they were kind of borrowing, taking, adapting, and so on. But what they were actually, in terms of the notional use, we can kind of stretch that word perhaps, is that they're essentially taking these documents in realization of the project, they're creating a different interpretation of a concept. Some key concepts that I identified were the idea of nation, which is very important during the post-war period, colonization. How do people interpret this idea of nation? So this group might describe it in this way, the other group may contest that, but they're still interested in creating this notion of a nation. And Latour says, this is great, concepts are just like things, they can move around. And the more a concept moves among the members of the network, the stronger the network becomes. And so in this contentious atmosphere, the more these key concepts, which so-called tokens, moved around from between these entities, not only did the network get stronger, but also these concepts were being constantly defined and being central to what was being made. So if we're looking at a landscape, very much like what J.D. Jackson does, in that there is an idea, there's a concept in that landscape. And what is that? It can be training and education, or nationhood, citizenship. These are the concepts that were being moved around. You have to kind of interpret your model in which to understand, okay, how did so-and-so approach that? And how did so-and-so contest that? How did the meaning change? How did the space change? And how did the practice change? So that was kind of what we chatted about.
Well, I'm sorry, I almost jumped in on you, because I think that one of the things that the jury noted, I was listening to our post, deliberation, jury conversation, where we couldn't speak to any of your books particularly because we hadn't announced it yet. But one of the things that came out was this idea of, these underlying principles or a unified sense of understanding the relationship between environment and culture, and the necessity of understanding history to create viable future in community. And one of the things that I think came out of it is that there's this deconstruction of the canon, which I think one of you mentioned. I'm sorry, I don't remember who. But this deconstruction of decolonization, yes, but also sort of this pulling apart of the canon to say that there are these other perspectives that haven't been considered that are necessary for a full story to appear. And I think that the way that the narratives centered around place, around specific concrete things that exist in the world, is what made them so powerful for the jury, that there was not just a story of people acting in the world, but that the world was acting back on those people in a sense. And I think that was one of the common threads we saw between the three books, that there was this powerful description of the complexity of a project, and put that into an arc of a narrative that was both elucidating, but also really captivating, not just sort of this rote thing like these buildings appeared and these things happened, but that they had powerful effects on the next people who come along. So yeah, I guess that's all I'd add. Well, actually, then that would bring me to maybe the last question. But one of the things that we talked about a lot was this idea of the role of narrative, and what is the future of narrative, and is that part of sort of a Western way of thinking about telling a story, and does that again get deconstructed or decolonized in a way, in the way that you might do future research? Or I feel like this question is a little bit half-baked. I'm not sure I'm quite nailing it, but like how do we continue to sort of push these boundaries of what the three of you have offered to us? How do maybe all the students in the audience take your lessons from these extraordinary books and begin to even push them further? Or where are you pushing them next? Maybe that's a little more fair.
Maybe just since I was going to respond, I was thinking about this when you were speaking a minute ago. I think the thing about whether it's decolonizing the field or decolonizing that, I don't think, I think for me it starts with saying we're not going to end up with a more complete narrative. We're not going to end up with a more complete story. History as a craft of storytelling. History is an art and not a storytelling. So when you say what's the future of the narrative, I think actually the narrative is growing and becoming stronger because of the diversity of narratives that are now being told. We're not going to end up with more complete stories. In some sense, we're going to end up with more complete stories, but only in the most fragmentary way. because the amount that we don't have is so much greater than the amount that we do have, that what we're doing is making different choices about the narratives and the stories that we're telling. I think for me, that part is really important. In part saying, you know, I made a series of choices, and this goes back to the question maybe that Robert asked about what we're doing. I made a series of choices that there were certain things that I couldn't know. I couldn't know what the emperor did with his eyebrow, or the look at his eyes, or whatever he said. You know, the least material, there were certain questions that I could not answer. And because my sources wouldn't tell me, I couldn't. So what I did was I really tried to look hard at the questions that I had sources to address. And think about what I thought the important questions were, how I could directly relate that to broadening, breaking open canon, or moving away from them. So the last you asked, what did they move to then? So my current project is a project, I was asked if I would write a book on the history of cartography in China, which I foolishly agreed to do, and then thought a little bit more about what I could have done. And that was a fool's errand, because if you go from a place of source scarcity in the Qing, in the Kangxi period, you go to this, and it's not a story in general, you go to a space of sort of source circuit in the history of cartography. There are just maps everywhere, and they're all over the place. And so what it became actually was a project about how people in China over the course of, say, the last 1,000 years in a variety of different contexts have individually and collectively conceptualized or imagined space. Sort of Sartorian something like, well, how do they order the state, the world around them? Or also Jackson, you know, how do we think about the way the world goes around them? And then seeing that as the sort of end game, as the sort of visual expression, material expression of that project. But trying to think more about also for me in Chinese art, how to get away from a history that is dominated by elite men, but even more crucially in this case, in the men part, particularly the elite part, the idea that we're only telling a story that is top down. And how could I use cartography as a way of furthering this project? Around coming from the court story. But further this project of working from, at least if not the bottom up, the more broader base of those.
Yeah, and the point that you made about storytelling is, I think, really important and really crucial. For me, what I was trying to do in the dissertation that became the book was to tell a story of who these families were, who these people were. Probably my least favorite parts of the writing were the architectural descriptions, the building descriptions. And so what did all of this mean, this involvement in the built environment in New Orleans mean for these families, for these individuals? And really, that's kind of the common thread in much of my work and my writing. And so currently, actually, right now, I have students who are completing the installation of an exhibition in our School of Architecture on contributions of African American classroom and builders to construction of the campus at the University of Texas, and then contextualizing that within the find of a sign on one of the buildings that's now part of our architecture campus, which was the first library building on campus. And when they removed some marble panels in the space that was historically a bathroom, they found a sign that said "for whites" on the wall. And so it was just like, what? And then, realizing that that was directed basically towards African American stonemasons who were working on that building, because we have photographs of them. And so piecing that story together from disparate materials that people maybe had seen in an archive or not. And then what that meant in the context of the construction of campus over the years, architecture in Austin. And so really broadening some of these narratives, inserting different voices in those stories is really a lot of what I do. So thinking about, the canon. It's not to me about expanding the canon. It's just, just the canon, but like everybody and everybody's stories should be in the canon or part of the canon, because that's what gives us our architecture and our built environment and our experiences. And so just thinking about what some of those stories are, and so with this exhibition, I'm writing a biography on John Chase, which is, it's hard to write a biography, really, it's hard. It's one of those things that, what did I agree to do? I asked myself that daily, with that project, and then with all of the stories, especially in Austin, because that hometown has been for a couple of decades, and all of these different pieces and learning about builders and architects. And there's not, and never has been a sort of written Black history of Austin. And I was like, well, what a great way to tell that history by talking about the history of the African-American builders in the city. And so that's kind of like the next project brewing, you know, a little bit down the road. But really just an inclusion of different voices, you know, different classes of people, different genders of people within these stories to enrich our community.
Yeah, that's a great question, a very good question. I think for the students, maybe if you think about it, in architecture school, we think about buildings through the narratives of the architect or narratives of style a lot of times. That's kind of what this question really refers to. And then what are some other narratives too, which we can talk about the built environment, and social histories and other ways, maybe Marxist analysis or tropes of modernization, like the one that I work on, that sort of thing. So the narrative, one of the things that fascinates me is that how interconnected the narratives are. So it's not like one can really make a conscious decision, okay, I'm going to do this type of a narrative, and then I'm not going to talk about anything else. But you actually find yourself having to tell really other things. And one of the things that trying to do this book, okay, so I'm still doing the narrative of these artifacts and these, cultural roots, and who are kind of involved in the conceptualization of this project. I think the primary aim became for me to work with all those narratives, but and the stories and the positionality of these people involved, but to show that it's not a monolithic development project that can be just kind of put in a box and canonized, and that each project actually has other stories to tell, and marginalized voices, and the way that kind of shape and evolved and implemented actually includes a number of other contested positions, diverging positions that can be told as a way of even colonizing these very narratives that you might kind of just that might seem traditional. So I think there's still some food for work to be done in looking at the ways that the canon, in the ways that the canon is constructed, and those who are actually, in what context with those canons non-convinced and used.
And so doing the production, understanding those voices as well are increasingly important. And for me, it's really, as I've said already, about like finding the human element. So what's the thing that, finding those aspects of human nature and those stories, and individual stories. One thing that I do with my classes for their research project, we're doing a digital humanities project about, whatever is all these minutes with the fact and it's actually crazy. And so it's like, well, what if, what tool do you feel like is missing? What do you want to learn more about? What do you want to know about? Think about your own experience with the built environment, with space, with architecture. What are those stories didn't like to get at, is how I encourage them to approach the research project, in one of my classes. And so I think, as we can increasingly get broader sectors of society, you know, people to be able to do that in their intersection and interaction with architecture, with the built environment, general landscape, and whatnot. We'll have more of that sort of social history that should really be part of it. We look at the built environment.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for this exquisite conversation, for your beautiful works. We're deeply grateful that you could join us here today. Thank you so much for this time. Thank you all for being here.